Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, at the request of Navark, Tully DT, among others, this has been a very highly requested topic, and frankly is a topic that I've been looking to cover for a very, very long time, and given all the 22nd century based stuff we've been doing these past few weeks, it seems like now is as good a time as any to talk about it, and that is the Warp 5 engine. Okay. So this video is going to really serve as a kind of a jumping off point and possibly a future basis of comparison. So we can use this to jump into the basics of antimatter reactions. And also this will also be relevant for talking about original series warp drive, as well as then a point of comparison with later vertical reactors that of course come in during the movie era. So there'll probably be a follow-up at some point. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is the end of fusion drive, because fusion drive prevailed pretty much up until the mid-22nd century. Fusion drive was the easier, cheaper method. Antimatter drive, while more powerful, potentially more powerful, had a lot of issues tied to it, which we will go into. For starters, humans are going into space and they are traveling to other worlds using fusion drive. So now we're going to take a brief look at some of the fusion drives employed, or what probably was the primary fusion drive employed, because that gives us an idea of the kind of technological background that exists, and then how that then ties into antimatter drive, because there's going to be some overlap with the technology, because they're both trying to do the same thing. In terms of different kinds of fusion, right, there is a gigantic rabbit hole. There's a lot of different kinds of fusion, but it's pretty clear that actually the kind of fusion humans are using in the 22nd century is probably tokamak fusion, which is basically the one where you have compressed plasma spinning around a donut. That seems to be what was actually in use. In Deep Space Nine, Chief O'Brien references how the Cardassians use inertial confinement and how much he hates that system, which suggests that actually Starfleet doesn't have a huge amount of experience with inertial confinement, suggesting that they were using tokamak. And given how far tokamak technology has progressed and the later issues with inertial confinement, for the point of reference, is where you bombard a fuel with lasers from all sides. The fuel item collapses in on itself and commences a fusion reaction. Without getting too much into it, I don't see that being used in human fusion reactors, at least in the 22nd century. There seem to be issues with it today, such as the requirement for a high startup cost. So in order to actually get that initial ignition, you need to have a substantial battery power or something else that's generating power for you. Whereas tokamak reactors, once they're up and going, they go for quite a while and only need a little bit of topping up with deuterium. I can see inertial confinement being used potentially later, potentially as a secondary system when you've got more available power from antimatter drive. It doesn't seem like a sensible power plant for a purely fusion powered ship. I think tokamak reactors have a lot more promise, but there are issues with these as well. So for example, tokamak reactors will produce consistently, but they will produce relatively low energy. It's hard to crank them up to the level of to provide the level of energy needed for higher warp factors. They're also large, and it's very, very difficult to get around that fact. Tokamak reactors are large bits of kit, and they have to be a certain size in order to be minimally viable. Whereas for a short-range craft, and perhaps for a impulse-powered shuttle, a inertial confinement system, again, particularly if it can charge up using power from the ship. Those are some just very brief thoughts about inertial confinement against tokamak reactors. A very, very layman's term explanation of the very surface of this whole area of science. I am not a science man. I'm not a scientist man. I don't know these things, but all I know is, that's the very basic stuff, and someone else in the comments will probably explain it more eloquently than I can. But the point being, tokamak reactors particularly require a good understanding and use of magnetic confinement fields. Tokamak is low energy, inertial confinement works only really on short-range stuff. So you need something that can provide additional power to make your ship go faster, and also something that brings you more endurance. You want to reach higher speeds and achieve longer range. Antimatter seems to offer a chance of achieving that goal by being more energy efficient than fusion, and also less fuel intensive than fusion, comparatively speaking. So there are just a couple problems with antimatter. A few. As I say, how do you even make it? It doesn't exist. It's not real. You have the other problem that also antimatter likes to explode. It's hard to store because of the aforementioned exploding. And also, it produces a lot of energy, but it's actually very hard to get all that energy properly absorbed in such a way that it's useful. So it's difficult to convert the energy produced in a matter-antimatter reaction into useful energy. So what do? So the first problem we have to solve is containment. Now actually, as I say, we already know how to contain antimatter because of our experience with working with tokamak reactors, which make use of magnetic confinement fields. You can use a magnetic confinement field to hold antimatter right there in a vacuum, and it's not touching anything. So that's simple enough. Creating anti-deuterium is also achievable thanks to human work with fusion reactors, because basically what you do is it's a kind of inverse. It's no one. I can't really describe the process. Again, someone in the comments will delineate this far better. But effectively, what's going on? You're taking two deuterium particles, hydrogen particles, and you're squashing them together, but through a bit of, subspace manipulation and stuff. Instead of achieving fusion reaction, you're creating a piece of antimatter. You're basically, I don't know specifically how that works, but you're basically inverting the charge, the entire charge of the atom. I don't know how two positives make a negative. That's about my most basic of maths knowledge. Someone who knows better can explain in the comments. But basically that's what you're doing. You're taking two deuterium particles and squashing them together, which you can do because you have fusion reactors and you have pretty extensive experience at this point of squashing things together inside a fusion reactor. Great. There are now two problems which are quite difficult to surpass and in which our experiences with fusion don't help. That's the problem of the catalyzation of the reaction, so containing the reaction properly. It's quite difficult, again, without exploding. You need a harmonious vessel in which the reaction can take place. If there's any kind of molecular or even submolecular, subatomic flaw in the structure, the thing is going to shatter and you'll have an explosion on your hands. You also have the problem of getting efficient energy transfer. There's an awful lot of energy that is produced by these reactions that doesn't seem to easily translate into a plasma, which is basically your main energy medium. It's what you're going to be using for powering most of your starship, is a kind of plasma, or later electroplasma. In any case, the reactions are hard to control, they're hard to contain, and they're hard to convert into useful energy. You're losing a lot of energy is being wasted. So, how do we solve these problems? Well, the answer is dilithium crystals. By the way, the reference for this is down below. There's a whole article with beautiful GIFs and animations, which I'll probably be using in the video, that kind of demonstrate exactly what's going on. I'm just breaking it down in very, very loose layman's terms. I'm no grease monkey. Essentially what's happening is that you have your dilithium crystals, which serve as your primary reaction catalyst and means of energy diffusion. So, You have the large crystal, which is the primary ignition crystal, and that catalyzes the reaction. This has to be like a perfect dilithium crystal. It has to be completely molecularly homogeneous, and then you project like a magnetic field around it as well to contain it. And the way to think about it is the dilithium crystal is a neutral ground between matter and antimatter. It's neither positively nor negatively charged. So it serves as a perfect medium for the two particles, the deuterium and antideuterium, to interact. Then you release the deuterium and antideuterium particles into the dilithium crystal. They meet in the middle. They react with one another. They release a huge amount of energy. That energy is now conducted through that dilithium crystal. Now, that's an awful lot of energy for one dilithium crystal, and yes, normally a dilithium crystal, even a perfect one, would explode with that level of energy going through it. But you have magnetic containment fields that allow a line of basically conduction, and what they do is they can draw the energy down a line of smaller secondary dilithium crystals. These can be imperfect because they're not actually housing a matter-antimatter reaction. They only have to contain and conduct the byproducts of that reaction, various forms of heat, light, and radiation on a scale on which we can barely fathom. And you channel it down that line. That then converts the energy derived from the matter-antimatter reaction into something that can be transferred into plasma. So that then energizes the plasma. That plasma then receives the charge from the antimatter reaction and has become now energized into warp plasma, effectively. So that's plasma that is now hot enough to heat up the thorium coordinate coils and generate that warp reaction. There's all sorts of other things you can do with that plasma as well, but the first place they will go to is the nacelles, because those are basically the only thing that are rated to cope with that kind of power. That's the basics of the matter-antimatter reaction in these Archer-style reactors. So with the NX reactor, we are looking at a reactor with one primary crystal and 5 secondary crystals. The plasma is energized and then it's held at the back of the reactor until it's actually used. It's also kind of there that you can also regulate the plasma and make sure that you're not heating it too much or too little, and heat it to a level that you want it to. So as well as controlling the matter and antimatter reaction through the dilithium crystal, you're also going to have people on either side of that reactor, and they're basically there to control the energy level of the plasma. So it's a kind of a twofold thing. With the design of that Archer engine, you've got the guy at the front, and he's going to be controlling that matter-antimatter reaction, because that's where that happens. That happens at the front, although what you're seeing in the NX warp core is not actually the matter-antimatter mix. That's actually the plasma whirring around, rather than the matter-antimatter reaction, because you do not want to just have a small screen between you and a matter-antimatter reaction, let me tell you. Now, of course, in their early development, one of the problems of the Archer-style engine was the intermix. Now, it's unclear exactly what they meant when they said intermix. It might have something to do with the intermix between matter and antimatter. I'm not so sure, because that's a pretty self-explanatory intermix. More likely, it's to do with the regulation of the warp plasma, and probably what was happening was that the warp plasma was becoming unstable at higher temperatures and they couldn't control it properly. So that was probably why things like the NX Alpha exploded during trials, is because they lost plasma containment, not antimatter containment. Plasma is still hot and it can do you a lot of damage if you don't contain it properly. That's probably one of the early problems. As I say, by the time of the NX-01's launch, that seems to have been solved very well. What seems to be the main issue during the NX-01's career, at least from what we see in Star Trek Enterprise, is achieving sort of stability and consistency. Again, that's going to have about as much to do with the regularity of injectors as it will be the stability of the warp plasma, and again, not overheating that or allowing a runaway energy surge that you then can't control. Your putting in too much energy for the plasma itself to contain. That's probably one of the key limiting factors. There's various limiting factors that will affect how hard you can run your engine. One of those is your dilithium crystals and how much energy they can actually take. The other thing that is going to affect you is how much plasma you can contain. The more plasma you have, the larger core, the more plasma you have, the more energy that can be regulated and held and retained. Then you have the question of what are your plasma transfer conduits rated for? And then you have to ask, what are your nacelles rated for? Are you actually going to risk overheating your Veturium Cortinide coils? Or are you going to risk something further down in the core with basically a plasma overpressure where you've overheated the plasma and you can't get it out of the core fast enough, and so your core explodes? So there's all sorts of issues that there are with these kind of Archer style engines, and there's a reason you need so many people sticking around these engines. They're complex pieces of machinery and very, very dangerous pieces of machinery, and they need to be constantly watched and monitored, because what somebody does at the top end, at the matter-antimatter reaction end, will affect you, the plasma technician, down the bottom end, supervising the flow of plasma to the nacelles, which is just something worth noting. Now, with specific problems to this kind of system, it's dilithium intensive. Even with the NX-01, which is a pretty small ship with a pretty small reactor, you're looking at, well, one very large dilithium crystal, which you will need to replace eventually, and then 5 smaller dilithium crystals that you're going to be replacing fairly regularly because they will be subject to decay. It's also subject to energy loss. Again, as the dilithium crystals move towards the end of their lifespan, they're probably going to become less energy efficient, and that's going to just continually happen as you run the core. Another thing you're going to struggle with is damage to the dilithium crystals. This is less of a problem with when you're running these engines at about Warp 5. Dilithium crystals can handle those kind of temperatures. But when we start talking about Warp 7, Warp 8, Warp 9, old scale, then we start running into some very dangerous territory, and there's a good, particularly over sustained periods, and you could well shatter your dilithium crystals. And so that means that you need to be able to replace your dilithium crystals mid-flight. This then leads to further issues around fuel economy and logistics, and again, that I will talk about. If you want me to do a video on the Enterprise's warp core, I'll cover it there, because it's a whole separate issue beyond the scope of this particular video. But if you want a video on the problems of the Constitution's warp systems, I can do that. So, in conclusion, despite these issues, and there are numerous issues, it's a primitive technology after all. It was a first draft antimatter reactor. But despite this, it's a pretty solid first draft. It lasted over 140 years, which gives you some indication of just how efficient this design was and how it could be built up. Again, we would eventually, of course, see the vertical collision reactor later on. That's a long, long time in the future, and up until then, they were running on Archer-style reactors for over 140 years, and for the most part, they were fine. Of course, like every new piece of technology, it had its rocky beginnings, but it was a very solid and very impressive piece of technology, and it saved the Earth. I mean, what more do you want? If it was not for this Warp 5 reactor, Earth would have lost the Romulan War. The Earth would not have had a hope in hell. It was only by the work of Henry Archer and the stubbornness and commitment of men like Jonathan Archer that meant that the antimatter drive program even succeeded to begin with, and the Earth didn't fully commit to fusion instead, because that was definitely on the table. If Earth had committed to fusion, they would have been at a severe disadvantage when fighting the Romulans. As it was, because they developed their antimatter reactors, they then had an advantage over the Romulans, an advantage that saved humanity. So, those are my thoughts on the Warp 5 reactor. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As scientist men, if you know science good and can explain the things I was trying to describe in my very ham-fisted way, please do in the comments below. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you to my members. My Navarks. Jeffrey Ballard. Tully DT. Rella, and David Reeves. My commanders, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Tye, Bird Monster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narata, Dasplas, Adam Bowman, Nathaniel Mead, DM Tribal Typhoon, Gabe Logan, Mr. Fleagle, Nicholas Walsh, and Tom Zaros. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okokatum Questo, Squadra Course, John Nicole, Athie's Collection, and Tobias Klein. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants, and we welcome Alexander Karas and the Gundam Dynams. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.